Hello folks, my name is Mark, this is Why I Hate the World, how you guys doing? And this is Stupid Things That Libertarians Say, right? So I'll try to keep this one short because I could go off on this subject for quite a while. So the first thing I want to start off with is this idea that taxation is slavery, which is, bullshit, right? You hear this a lot from libertarians, taxation is slavery, it's like thievery and it's no different, the tax man coming and you being forced to pay your taxes is no different than like being robbed in a dark alley, stuff like that. That's complete bullshit. For example, because they tend to bring this up whenever the subject of taxation is, broached, no matter what the context is. So, for example, I was watching this one channel, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was talking about during the presidential debate how that subject came up of reappropriating money that's being held by corporations in offshore tax havens, right? And that came up during the debate, and they were talking about, well, what's the proper, what's the correct tax rate, that will encourage companies to bring it back here. And this guy, I'll see if I can find the video. If I can, I'll put it in the bottom. This guy basically said, well, the correct tax rate is 0 because taxation is, thievery, which is complete and utter horseshit, okay? It's not thievery, all right? It's distinctly different, like you being forced to pay taxes is distinctly different than someone coming to your house and robbing you, And I'm not gonna, I'm not saying that it's voluntary, because taxes should not be voluntary. Right, but what taxes are more akin to a fee that you have to pay in order to do something, So in this society, we have the commons, right? Things like things that everybody uses and should have equal access to. Everybody should have access to police protection, for example. Everyone should have access to education, right? Myself personally, I would put things like water and electricity under that, but currently that's not considered the commons, But anyway, yeah, things like that, things like roads, right? Education, infrastructure that we all use, So, for example, your electricity is not part of the commons, right? But the fact that if you buy a house, it's hooked up to the electrical grid is, that kind of thing, right? And also, a lot of that has to do with services that the government provides as well. Making sure that the food that you eat doesn't kill you. For example, regulating the nuclear power industry so that they don't like explode and kill everybody. Like we don't have fucking Fukushima style meltdowns and shit like that. Protecting environmental protection, right? Making sure that some corporation or whatever just doesn't dump their garbage someplace and kill all the surrounding wildlife and poison water supplies, that kind of thing. That's all considered part of the commons, right? And if you live in this society, then it's only moral and just for you to pay for these things because you take advantage of them, right? And something you hear from libertarians a lot is like, well, I don't take advantage of these things. Yes, you do. Okay, yes, you do. Like they'll say some shit like, well, drill your own well. If you want your own water, drill your own well on your property. Well, what if you don't have any property, right? What if you live in an apartment building in a city? What are you gonna go drill a fucking well in the middle of your bathroom? Like that doesn't make any sense, right? And it's this idea that they're stuck in this mentality of that we're all like living on sharecropper farms in like the 1850s and shit, and it's like, no, this is it doesn't work that way in modern society, right? And part of the upkeep of modern society is paying taxes, right? Now you could say that, well, it's thievery because they force me to do it, right? That's bullshit too, okay? Because taxes are laws, right? And you have input on how the law is formed, right, at some level, okay? Now, each and every one of us don't get to go dictate what the law is, but you do have elected representatives that craft the laws, including tax laws, right? And if you want lower taxes, then you can vote for the candidate that's going to create the lower taxes, Another thing is that you can repeal tax laws, right? Can you repeal thievery, right? Can you just like be like, a guy comes to rob you and go, you know what, we repealed thievery, you're not allowed to do this anymore. And he goes, oh, okay, sorry, there's no such thing as thievery anymore, you guys repealed it. No, that's complete fucking bullshit. It's because it's a bad analogy, okay? It's a bad analogy. It's the kind of shit that teenagers think of. Slightly related to this is another libertarian axiom that isn't very true. And it's this idea that money is a measure of labor. You hear this a lot from these guys, you know, especially when it comes to like the reason why poor countries, you know, should allow things like sweatshops and shit like that, you know, which you seem to get a lot of like support from libertarians. They'll say things like, oh, well, there's not enough, you know, there's not enough wealth in that country, right? And they have to go through this step, right? And, you know, there's not enough wealth there, and wealth is generated by labor. That's not true, okay? Wealth is not generated by labor. Wealth is simply a measure of resources, okay? And, you know, money in itself is not, you know, indicative of labor. Money is just a medium of exchange, and it could be anything, okay? That's the thing. It's like, you know, because if it was really labor, then you would think that you would have to actually labor to earn it. But there's lots of instances where you can obtain currency, you can obtain money without actually like laboring very much, you know. You can inherit it, right? You can find it in the street. You can, you know, do something like have investments that don't require any labor on your part, right? You know, compound interest and shit like that. And you know, so it's not really labor per se. It's more of just, it's a measure of wealth, you know, and wealth can take many forms, you know. So when you hear some shit like, well, you know, sweatshops are good for Bangladesh. That's another thing that I hear from libertarians, you know. Sweatshops are good for developing countries because it creates wealth. No, it doesn't. You know, it creates wealth for the upper 1% of people who own the sweatshops, but the people who actually work there aren't really getting any wealth, you know. They're being exploited, and there seems to be a very, you know, this is one of those reasons, one of those justifications that libertarians use to accept the idea of people being exploited, because it fits in with their philosophy of no government regulations. One last thing I want to touch on before we leave here, and it's the idea of the non-aggression principle, which is something that sounds really good in theory. And this is one of the main reasons why they say that taxation is thievery. So the idea goes that in order to have a free society, no one should ever initiate force against another person. And since taxes are backed by the threat of force by the government, then taxation is, you know, that's why taxation is thievery, you know. And that's bullshit too. There are instances where one is justified in initiating force, mainly those instances where they know that force is going to be initiated against them, and so you do a preemptive strike, right? Now, whether you think that's moral or not, there are instances where I believe it could be considered moral, right? But, you know, the thing about applying that to taxation just doesn't make any sense. I mean, because you're not, you know, like how, all right, here's the thing. How do you make people who don't want to pay, how do you make them pay? All right, how do you do it? So you have your society, right? You have the common things that people use, everybody has to use in order, you know, and that the government is there to ensure that everyone should have equal access to. Yet you get people who just don't want to contribute, you know, whether it's, you know, some dude who's like scamming welfare and just doesn't want to work, or whether it's some rich guy who's using loopholes to like get out of paying taxes, whatever. It doesn't matter which end of the, you know, spectrum you come from, right? How do you make them pay, you know, and why is it that that person gets to not pay while everybody else does? See, how do you resolve the issue of freeloaders, right, without giving the government the ability to persecute people, right, for not contributing, you know? Because here's the thing, is that you know, have the choice of, you can choose which country you want to live in, right? Now you'll hear a bunch of shit from libertarians saying things like, oh, well, it's not that easy. Yeah, nobody said it had to be easy, okay? But you do have the choice. You can move to a country that has a lower tax rate, you know. Places like Algeria, you know, they have like a 0% personal income tax rate. You can move there, okay, if you want to. All right, you can go start your own country, you know, in fucking Antarctica or some shit, right? You can go do, you know, so there are things you can do, right, if you really truly wanted to get around the fact that the government is forcing you to pay taxes, okay? But, you know, you don't do that. Instead, you sit back and you blame everybody else, right? Because, you know, you have to pay taxes the same way that everybody else fucking does. You know, if you don't like how the tax rate, you know, if you don't like the tax laws in this country, there is a way to remediate that. And it's called democracy. You know, you work really hard, right? You elect the person that you think is going to change the tax law in the way that you want, right? And then you apply political pressure on that person in order to make them do it, right? That's how the system works. And personally, I think it's a good system, right? I think it's as close as we're ever really going to get to actually like realizing self-rule, you know, without some kind of like direct, you know, I don't know, direct computer-aided, you know, elections or some shit like that, which I don't really see that happening for, you know, not in my generation, right? Maybe a few hundred years from now. But anyway, that's time for another video. So here's the thing about this, is that there are dozens and dozens of more libertarian axioms that we could pick apart. And I could probably make like 5 or 6 different videos just about libertarianism in general and why I think, you know, it falls short and the stupid things that libertarians say. So if you have an example of any, please leave me a comment, you know, at the bottom of what you'd like me to talk about next. Right. Adios, folks.